Good afternoon. My name is Mike Traugott, and I'm the interim director of the Center for Political Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 27th Miller-Converse lecture. This is the signal event at the Center for Political Studies, as it honors two of our most outstanding scholars and legends in the behavioral study of politics. My own career has been inextricably linked to both of them, for which I am, of course, extremely grateful. Warren Miller was a great institutionalist, creating and leaving behind organizations that remain central to the current study of behavioral social science. As the director of the Political Behavior Program in the Survey Research Center, Warren took the program out of SRC to form the Center for Political Studies in 1970, and he served as its first director. He was the director of the election studies from the 1950s, converting the data collection to the American election studies, and then in 1977, to the American National Election Studies. Along the way, Warren created the Inter-University Consortium for Political Research in 1962 to facilitate the distribution of the election study data, and through the summer program, a venue in which to teach interested individuals how to analyze the data. The ICPR, of which Warren was the first director, has now become the ICPSR, currently the largest social science data archive in the world. Warren also participated in the founding of the Social Science History Association in 1979 and served as its first president. In 1968, Warren began a stint as a consultant to ABC News, helping them with their election coverage. He invited me to assist him in this effort as a graduate student. We would fly to New York on Mondays during the primaries and later in the general election to participate in rehearsals and then go live on Tuesday night. Across the next few electoral cycles, I was a participant observer next to Warren of the way that television captured election coverage from newspapers. This piqued my interest in this new field and set me off on a career as a political communications scholar. Phil Converse was also a great mentor and chaired my dissertation committee. Perhaps because of my work with Warren, I suppose, he invited me to co-author an invited article in Science entitled Assessing the Accuracy of Polls and Surveys. This was an amazing honor and contributed to my professional visibility early in my career. It also gave me an insider's view of manuscript preparation and editing from one of the best writers in the field. Outside of participating in his baseball pool, affectionately known as the Con Game, I had a very enjoyable set of interactions with Phil across all of his time in Ann Arbor. He also had a distinguished administrative career, serving as the director of the Center for Political Studies, the director of ISR, and the director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University in 1989. Both Warren and Phil were presidents of the American Political Science Association. These are the two icons that we honor with this lecture today. So now I would like to turn to our invited lecturer, Jamie Druckman. Jamie is the Martin Brewer Anderson Professor of Political Science at the University of Rochester. He has been there for a little over 2 years after serving for 19 years at Northwestern University. He's authored more than 200 articles and book chapters, and he co-authored or edited several books, including the influential Experimental Thinking, a Primer on Social Science Experiments, published by Cambridge University Press. Google Scholar shows that his research has been cited by academics nearly 50,000 times. Well over half of these citations occurred in the last 5 years. I only can cite selectively from Jamie's extensive professional accomplishments in his CV. Jamie is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the recipient of a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship. He is the co-principal investigator of time-sharing experiments in the social sciences, the TEST project, and the editor of the Cambridge Elements series on experimental political science. Jamie is the co-principal investigator of the Civic Health and Institutions Project, which provides national and state level estimates of public attitudes and behavior. And of significance to us in CPS, he is the current chair of the Board of Advisors to the American National Election Study. Jamie's current research focuses on affective political polarization. Much of it reported in the co-authored book, Partisan, Hostility in American Democracy, published by the University of Chicago Press. He's going to talk to us today about that thread of his research in a presentation entitled States of Distrust, Science and Politics in the United States. Please welcome Jamie Druckman.
You, Mike. Well, thank you, Mike, for that extremely gracious introduction. Thank you, all of you, for coming today. This is really a career highlight. You know, it's pretty overwhelming to be honored with a Miller-Converse address. I never had the privilege of meeting either in person. I was able to talk to Professor Miller on the phone towards the end of his life. I was a graduate student at UCSD, and it was I think it was about 1998. And they were having a conference for the ANES on innovations in new ways to go forward with the ANES. And they invited all kinds of people from different disciplines, including people from zoology and biology. It was really fascinating. Lots of things on kind of animal behavior. And it was uncertain if Professor Miller was going to come. And I was tasked by Skip Lupia, who was my advisor. I was tasked to be in charge of making sure that if he came, to pick him up at the airport and drive him to the campus, to the meeting. And of course, this was 1998, so that, you weren't emailing anybody. And so I remember I had to call him. So to give you some context, 1995 was when the ANES started their first website. And so we're just a little bit after the first website. So I called him, extremely nervous, and I had, I think a half-an-hour conversation with him. And he was telling me all about the history of the ANES and kind of all these things. And he was excited for this meeting, which he thought would be kind of a new, kind of innovative thing to experience. So that was a very memorable phone call. Again, as I said, unfortunately, he did not come. But that was really great. Just more generally, just being here and giving this lecture, I was going to try to kind of start to list off the people in this room that are right here who have influenced me, but it would take far too long. I guess at the top of the list is Don, and so Don would be. Well, I don't think Skip's here, so Skip was, as I said, was my advisor, so he kind of shaped everything that I think have become. I think will be evident in what I talk about today as well. Don was certainly extremely influential. I've done a lot of work on experiments. Don was one of the first persons to have the idea that we could do experiments in 1989, edited volume? Yeah, okay, we'll go with that, yes. And so, yeah, the book that Mike mentioned in the introduction, Partisan Hostility, was co-authored with John and Yana, who are somewhere sitting here. I saw. Avery Goods was a co-author of mine when she was an undergraduate, and Ted and Nick, I've known my whole career. Yeah, just like I feel like I'm going to leave people out now, so I'm just going to. Lisa Dish was my next door office mate in my first job, and so yeah. So I apologize if I'm leaving you out because I'll run out of time if I continue. But I thank you to everybody in the room and for your inspiring work as well. And so, as Mike said, the title of the talk is States of Distrust, Science and Politics in the United States. But let me start, I'm going to repeat some of what Mike said by putting this a little bit in the context of Miller and Converse. And so this is really what Mike went over. These are just pictures. So that's the famous pictures that a lot of you have probably seen of them working on the ANES. And one of the points I wanted to make, because it's important historically, but also relevant to this talk, are the institutions of science that they helped establish, and the ones that Mike went through, right, including what was then ICR, just ICR, right? PR, it was PR, and then added the S, right? ICPR, and then like ISR, and then Center for Political Studies, and Converse was the director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. So establishing those institutions were very important, and institutions of science are central to what I'm going to speak about. Another thing that's central to what I'm going to speak about is thinking about things over time. And so I'm going to talk a lot about over time. And these were two considerations that were very important to each of these scholars. This is a quote from, so I first discovered this quote in a reflection by Nancy Burns that was about the ANES history, and it was dedicated to Warren Miller, and in a footnote in there, she actually quoted Converse. He said it quickly became, he's talking about kind of when the ANES got started, it quickly became clear that part of the value of the study would derive from the replication of questions over time. And so that was certainly the case. But perhaps it wasn't entirely obvious to everybody when they first started out. And then in terms of Miller, this is an article, they would publish lots of articles on realignment and if this was a normal election or so on and so forth. This is an article from 1991 where he was talking about how party identification has really sustained as a very strongly predictive entity. But he also talked about kind of the realignment and how people have switched parties, which will, as you'll see in a moment, is very central to what I'm going to talk about. And so he said by the time of the first Reagan presidency, it was evident there was evidence of a classic version of the realignment of partisanship. It was a realignment of massive proportions, and there are real world consequences. And that's in essence some of the theme of what I'm going to talk about in a moment. And so let me finally start to talk about what I'm going to say. And a lot of what I'm going to speak about is COVID. And so COVID, to give you a sense of kind of where we were and where we are, right? This is the top slide is from the beginning of COVID, April 2020. This is by the Bipartisan Policy Center. And they're talking about US leadership during COVID pandemic response, right? And important to think about here, US as in the whole nation is going to be the leader of this response. So early in the pandemic, we have the pandemic. And now, as many of you probably know, we have a completely fractured public health system. So what the bottom slide is simply referencing that there are two different state consortiums that have now formed to have in essence, their own health systems outside of the CDC and the national health systems, come up with their own vaccination schedules and so on and so forth. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is what happened there. Like how is this fracturing occurring, and how can we make sense of the current intersection of politics and science, particularly with relevance to public health. So go back to COVID. This is something a lot of you are probably familiar with, or because it's gotten a fair amount of attention. This was in 2019, the Global Health Security Index, and it is a ranking of 195 countries in terms of how prepared they are for a pandemic. And what you can see here is the United States is the top ranked country. They were presumably the most prepared of 195 countries in the world for a pandemic. And then of course, one of the authors of that pandemic preparedness ranking was the first author of this article some years later. Why did the best prepared country in the world fare so poorly during COVID? And so, right, as you can see, this is on the y-axis, you can see is age-adjusted excess death rate, and on the x-axis is just the rating from that Global Health Security Index. And you can see, it's not news to anybody, the United States is a bit of an outlier in terms of their poor performance, right? They were way high on the index, but they had a high amount of death. So what happened? In the article, they talk about a variety of things in the article that I just mentioned. One is they failed to make full use of the preparedness capacities. Another is poor use of labs and data. Another is inadequate data, which there surely was. Another one is this federalism discoordination. And so these were all kind of potential explanations. And there's not, these all intersect and all probably relevant. I think for a lot of people in the social sciences and political science, one of the more prominent explanations was that there was this partisan divide that everybody was familiar with, right? And so these are 3 books, one of which, sorry, John and Yana, I'm throwing us all under the bus because I'm going to say that these books are not quite all right. Although I should say our focus was not really on COVID. And so there's a lot to read in our book. Our book is the middle one. So these are 3 books. And it's not that they're wrong. You'll see the story that I'm going to tell. But I think they're incomplete. And so a lot of the explanation was that we had calcified partisan disagreement, or there were high levels of partisan animosity, or there was failure in dogmatism, ideological dogmatism on the behalf of kind of people in the knowledge sector. And that all led to this kind of discoordination and probably all these problems during COVID and potentially very high levels of mortality. And so what I'm going to argue is that US performance during COVID-19 actually reflected very entrenched aspects of society. And by entrenched, I mean very enduring, long-standing, that we could have actually anticipated this, concerning trust in scientists. And again, not to dismiss the role of partisanship or politics, because that's kind of the intersection that has exacerbated all of it. But a lot of it was not the current political moment, but actually things that had been in place for a very long time, at least going back 50 years. And this is problematic because you basically now have, for the first time, or at least the most heightened time, this intersection of partisan politics. So not just politics, but partisan politics and science, and that's created a very combustible and problematic challenge for the public health sector and basically for any science sector. Towards the end, I will talk about how to build trust in scientists and kind of so a little bit of something more positive, at least for those of us who think science is a positive. And so the outline, I'm going to talk kind of briefly about delegating to scientists. It's a pretty simple argument to give you some scaffolding of kind of what I'm thinking. I'll then talk about the evolution of trust in scientists over time and how that's occurred. I'll then move up to the state level and talk about trust in scientists at the state level and state public health outcomes. Then, as I mentioned, building trust in scientists, and then I'll conclude. And so this will be pretty quick. It's very, very easy to follow the logic. So basically, the first bullet point is to improve the world for the better. You need to know that world, and science is a pretty good way to do that. And so in essence, I'm starting from the premise that science is a helpful endeavor if we want to improve well-being in the world. Second point is that provision of public goods, which I would say would include public health, requires some delegation to experts. And in this case, I'm interested in experts like scientists and researchers, and in turn, it requires some trust in those experts. And so you have to have that going on. And so when you have individuals or states that are delegating differently, right, so they're delegating to different kinds of experts or different kinds of people that they think are experts, they're going to almost invariably arrive at different outcomes, or at least the probability of them arriving at different outcomes increases substantially. And so that's a pretty straightforward, that's pretty logically follows. But what we've seen then is over time, Democratic voters and states that vote Democratic have become increasingly more trusting of scientists, and Republican individuals and Republican states have become increasingly less trusting of science. And a lot of that, and I'll show you this in a moment, a lot of that comes from partisan sorting, where you see people from different demographic groups moving in and out of the parties. And so I'll show you pictures of this in a moment instead of trying to explain it right now. And so what you end up with is this kind of heterogeneous division in terms of the states, and then you have this heterogeneous division in terms of voters. And so what looks like partisan differences that everybody really glommed onto during COVID to explain COVID is completely confounded with differences in trust in scientists. And so it's really hard to differentiate those. And so I'm going to try to do that a little bit, but that's basically the argument. So insofar as I'm not dismissing partisanship as relevant. It's in fact a large part of the story in terms of what's the problem now. But there was this underlying trust in scientists component, which is quite important, as I will show you, for long-standing structural reasons. I'm going to skip over that. So very briefly, just in terms of concepts and measurement, which I can talk about for the rest of the time if people have questions, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we measure trust and trustworthiness. But just for the sake of what we're doing here, trust is a decision at one point in time. The idea of trust is you're making yourself vulnerable to somebody else. You're letting them give you information or make a decision on your behalf. And so therefore you're kind of you're entrusting them to do something that's in your interests. And so if you take a vaccine, you're trusting scientists that they kind of know what they're doing when they have produced that. Trustworthiness is a proximate correlate of trust, and that's a perception of that an actor has certain characteristics that would make them somebody worth, or an entity worth trusting. And so what I'm talking about here, I'm going to often use the word trust, but I'm really talking about trustworthiness. And so I just wanted to get that out of the way. Okay, now I'll finally get to some data and some patterns. And so this is data from the General Social Survey, which has been around since 1972. And they have been tracking confidence in different institutions continuously since 1972. And so they have this battery that asks you, I'm going to name some institutions in this country. As far as the people running these institutions are concerned, would you say that you have a great deal of confidence, only some confidence, or hardly any confidence at all in them? And then they list a bunch of institutions, one of which is the scientific community. So I'm going to put up this graph, which is just the trends in trust in scientists over time. And so the top line is only some. The second line is hardly a great deal, and the bottom line is hardly any. So what you see here is there's a lot of continuity. So trust in science is actually quite high. It's actually one of the more trusted institutions in the country over time and contemporary. And so that's important to keep in mind for everything else I'm going to subsequently say, because everything else I'm going to subsequently say is not as positive as this. And so, well, the next slide is descriptive, just breaking this out a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just focus for presentational purposes just on the percentage of people who have a great deal of trust in scientists. But I could do this in any number of ways, and the story would not change. So what this is just a graph of the percentage. So on well, I'll talk about the axes first. So on the x-axis is just the years over time. And on the y-axis is the percentage of people in a given group, which I'll talk about in a moment, who have a great deal of trust in scientists. And so the first box is gender. And so the top line is men, the bottom line is women. So what you see is this persistent, stable gap. Men are more trusting of science than women. The next is race. So in the GSS, for most of the history of the GSS, they only identified black and white respondents. And so that's all we have here. And so what you see here is that white respondents are consistently more trusting than black respondents. The next is rural versus urban. Rural is less trusting than urban. The next is religiosity. And so less religious people are more trusting than religious people. Education, more educated people are more trusting than low educated. And then class, people from middle upper class are more trusting than people from lower or working class. So the remarkable thing here is the stability, right? So we think about this partisan divide and trust that I've already referenced, but you have this incredible stability in these demographic groups, right? I mean, this is 50 years of kind of very little change in these demographic groups. So what happened during this time period is we saw a lot of change in the parties, right? We saw a lot of things go on. So we saw civil rights realignment, right? Where we saw a movement of white, lower educated, lower income people moving out of the Democratic Party. We had the Reagan coalition, which saw fundamentalist Christians moving out of the Democratic Party. There's been a secular surge, right? Where there's this rise of the religious nuns kind of going into the Democratic Party. By the end of the 20th century, we started seeing this sorting of place-based inequality. So rural people living in rural settings are moving out of the Democratic Party. And then, of course, I don't want to just point this all to demographic change. There are also a lot of politics going on during this time period as well, most notably climate change. And these types of kind of claiming science or rejecting science in certain domains also led to higher educated people moving presumably into the Democratic Party. So that's a lot of movement, and I don't expect that you're following all that. But in essence, this is percentage of people. So on the x-axis you see year, the y-axis is the percent of people who identify as Democrats. And so if you just look at the darker lines are the lower trusting people. They're the lower trusting groups that I showed you in the last graph. And you can see all the darker lines are more downward sloping than the lighter lines. So in other words, you're starting to see the lower trusting people are moving out of the Democratic Party, which is going on here. Again, I can show you this in the reverse somewhat for the Republican Party. And so what you end up with when you put all this together is you end up with something that looks like this. So this is the trust in scientists by party. And so this last one is just a great deal of trust. So again, we have on the x-axis years, on the y-axis the percentage of people who have a great deal of trust in science, right? So you start in the beginning of the time series. And so this is the best drawn, the best use of colors. This line right here is Republicans, and this line is Democrats. And so at the beginning of the time series, right, Republicans actually have more trust in science than Democrats. In around 2000, they're actually identical. Same percentages have a great deal of trust in scientists. And then you can kind of see what's happened since, right? Democrats go way up and Republicans go way down. And so part of that movement is just putting together the two graphs that I put up before, right? One graph, the stability in the demographics, and then you cross that with the change in the demographics in terms of their partisanship. And you end up with something that looks like that. But again, I don't want to completely dismiss politics, of course. Like as I mentioned, climate change, we see a lot of movement around the Tea Party. When the Tea Party movement, if you look very closely at that graph, you'd see a lot of movement around 2012, 2011. You see an enormous amount of movement around 2016 with Trump's first election, and then COVID, you see a lot of movement as well. And of course, these are quotes from Trump and the kind of emergence of their take on experts, right? The experts are terrible. Vance said during the vice presidential debate, stop listening to experts. And you can see this if I just plot. So what I'm going to show you next is just the demographic groups. So like those flat lines that I showed you before in terms of trust in scientists. So the outcome variable, what I'm going to show you is the trust in scientists and the demographic groups, but just among Democrats. And so what this is showing you, again, on the x-axis is years, the y-axis is percent with a great deal. So you can see those gaps are the same, are still there for Democrats, but there's upward sloping, right? So even putting aside it's a very rough way to show that even putting aside the demographics, you're seeing upward sloping. And then if we do the same thing for Republicans, right, you see downward sloping for Republicans. So it's not just demographic shift going on there. There seems to be also kind of general intercept shifts as well. And so what we end up with overall then, when we look, as I mentioned before, the GSS measures 13 different institutions. And so I'm going to put up 12. And this is again, on the x-axis is years. On the y-axis is the percentage of Democrats with a great deal of confidence in science minus the percentage of Republicans with a great deal of confidence in science. I'm sorry, in whatever institution is being asked about. And so you can see here, this is science. So you can see that that's the difference. And you might note that that is the largest difference of any of the institutions. So put another way, science is now the most polarized institution of these institutions. The second most is basically the Supreme Court, but it's by a large amount, and that's really reflective of partisanship, presumably. One other small aside, which really has nothing to do with the talk per se, but which I think is quite interesting. If you go back to the beginning of the time series, you see partisan gaps in major companies and organized labor, and so that's the labor management divide that divided the parties over all of modern history. But if you looked at any of these other institutions, there isn't really much of a partisan divide going back then. But if you look now, if you look at any of the knowledge-generating institutions, you see partisan divides for the most part. And if you look at things you might call the norm-enforcing institutions, like the military or religion, which are enforcing certain expectations, then you're going to see Republicans becoming more believing. So you start to see this kind of cleavages emerging in terms of trust in institutions as well. And so what we see then is stability of demographic groups' trust in scientists over time in the US. That might hide some partisan shifts, so we can kind of at the same time have partisan stability and partisan shifts. And that reflects resorting and presumably political entrepreneurs. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you the implications of that for state trends in response to public health challenges, mostly COVID, but then towards a little bit later, I'll talk about some other public health outcomes. And so one of the implications of the stability of trust in the demographic stability of trust amongst individuals is that it means that there's stability of trust amongst states. And let me explain what I mean by that. So most people don't move, right? I think a lot of you have probably heard, but the majority of people die within 30 miles of where they were born. And so it's always hard with a room of academics, right? Because we think of people moving all the time, but I believe in any given year, far fewer than 5% of the population moves. I think over a 10-year cycle, it's something like 10% or less. And this has decreased since the 1980s. And so one of the implications of that people don't move very much is that the demographics of a given state stay very stable, right? The demographics don't change in a given state. So what I'll show you here, that's just what I basically explained. So we took all of the states and we just went to the census and we got the percentage of different demographic groups. And then just for the sake of presentation, I just rank them from the most to the least. So for example, this is the percentage of the Black population in a given state. And this is from 1970s, and this is from 2010s, right? So if you just look at the rankings of the states, you can see that it's basically perfect, right? So the state, I think DC actually had the largest Black population in the 1970s, and I think it was first or second in the 2010s. And so I think it was Vermont had the most white population, and it still largely did. And so you can see this is for percent white, percent male. It's a little bit more scattered, can do the same thing for education. And so, of course, the demographics of the whole country have been changing, but the demographics within a state relative to other states have remained fairly constant. And so what that means is that if we just, I know I'm making a few inferential jumps here because this is, you still could see percentage changes, but I'm going to jump over all of that. I can come back to that if people ask later. But what you would expect then, given the demographic change at the individual level, we should, the trust stability at the individual level based on demographics, we should see trust stability at the state level. And so, because the demographics don't change, if that makes sense. Demographics have stably been related to trust. If the demographics don't change in a state, then trust should remain pretty much the same. So I took the GSS, and you can get trust in scientists by in the state of the individual's respondent. That's actually a restricted request from the GSS. I don't know if you guys knew that they restrict state level state data. And so, but I was able to get it, and then I aggregated by decade. And so what this is just so it's about 30 states, because the smaller states you can't get enough respondents. I had a rule of about 100 respondents minimum. So this is great percentage of a great deal of trust in scientists in the 1970s by state. And this is the percentage of a great deal of trust in scientists in the 2010s. And what you can see is that that trust has remained pretty strongly correlated, right? So it's correlated at about 0.52. And the average change of the percentage across states of the percentage of people who have a great deal of trust in science is 4.9%, which is not a very large shift in trust in scientists. And so we see this stability at the state level as well. Okay, now I'm going to turn to actually the public health outcomes. So we're going to, as I mentioned, I'm going to really focus on COVID-19. And so I'm going to talk about vaccination, of course. And so vaccination is a really important public health outcome, or a public health practice, of course. It reduces the burden on the healthcare system. It protects communities. And it's very straightforward to think if you trust scientists, you're going to be more likely to take the vaccine. So, right, you're more willing to make yourself vulnerable. And so you should see at the state level that more trust, also at the state level, that states with more trusting people, they're going to be more likely to get the vaccine. And they're also going to be probably more likely to make the vaccines easy to get in terms of having public health laws or reducing the administrative burden or things like that. So I'm going to look at the relationship between trust and vaccination. And I'm going to do that with data from a project that I've been a part of since the pandemic started. And this was a project that we started, me and three other colleagues, and then we kind of had differing sized teams. And it was called the COVID States Project. It's now called the Civic Health and Institutions Project. And the idea of this project is to get representative samples from all 50 states plus DC. So our motivation initially was when COVID hit, we figured that this was going to be a state level response because it seemed fairly clear that different states have different public health institutions. And we wanted to be able to follow disease surveillance at the state level because we didn't know if these public health authorities would do a very good job or not. And so we wanted to figure out a way to do surveys at an affordable level at the state level. And I'm not going to go through how we figured this out or the validation tasks that we went through. I think the data are reasonably valid. I mean, given kind of the source of the data, again, I can talk about all that later. So this is a project that's been going on. It's still ongoing. And so I'm going to show you individual data from August 2020, and then I'm going to look at their vaccination outcomes of the same individuals about a year later. And so these are people who, these are not panel data per se, but each of our samples is very large. So each time we do this, because we're getting samples from every state, we're getting about 30,000 respondents in each time we do a data collection. And so just inadvertently, we end up with a few thousand who are taking it both times because these are all people from online labor markets. And so we get repeat respondents. And so we are able to look at what their trust in 2020 and then their vaccination in 2021. And then I'm going to do a similar thing for the state data. I can explain later why I changed the date slightly. It doesn't really matter. So to give you a sense of the variation in trust at the state level, so in the GSS data, just initially going back to the GSS data, you might remember I said on average over time there was a 4.9% change in the percentage of people with a great deal of trust in science over time. Across states for any given decade, it's about 8%. So in other words, there's more variation across states in trust than there is over time in trust. And so the map is from our data. This is just a graph of the percentage of people who have a lot of trust in scientists And you can see there, ranges from 26.5% to about 46.5%. And so you have a pretty good range of states in terms of their trust in scientists. And so you can choose your favorite state here, right? And so you can see Michigan is there. Yeah, as some of you know, my mother is from the Upper Peninsula, so I imagine that might be pulling you down a little bit. And so, I can say that as somebody who spent a lot of time in the Upper Peninsula. And so, I'm going to first start with trust and vaccination at the individual level, and then I'll go to the state level. So this is just a bivariate plot. On the x-axis is just the 4 trust categories that we use, not at all, not too much, some, or a lot. And this is the percent who reported that they were vaccinated. So you can see there's a very strong relationship between trust and scientists and getting the vaccination. And then this is just from a regression, controlling for all kinds of other things. And the top coefficient is trust in scientists. So you can see it's having a pretty large effect. Being Republican is having a negative effect. You can see there as well. And so these things are both mattering. I'll explain what this is. So on the x-axis, this is the predicted trust in scientists, which I'll explain in a moment. And on the y-axis, again, is the percent vaccinated. So what I mean by predicted trust in scientists is because trust is such a stable attribute of people, we thought that we could take the GSS data from the 1970s and look at the demographic relationships between, here's your demographic profile, here's your trust level. And so we took that, and then we took the demographic data of our respondents in our survey, and we said, okay, what would their trust be based on what people who looked just like them in the 1970s trust was? And so we just imputed levels of trust based on 1970s levels of trust. The reason to doing that was because one of the arguments that I'm going to make is that we could have actually seen this variation in state response going back to the 1970s, because these were very stable levels of trust. And so in that sense, these are things that were very predictable. And so what we see here is a pretty strong relationship between that imputation of predicted trust in scientists and vaccination level. So now I'm going to show you states. So I'm going to just aggregate up to the state. So this is just average trust in scientists in a state. This is the vaccination rate in the state. So this vaccination rate data is just from the New York, I think this is from the New York Times. And so you can see here, again, a pretty strong relationship between trust in scientists and vaccination rate. Again, when we look at this in the regression, we're controlling for Republican vote. Percent over 65, and if there was a vaccine exemption in the state, you can see trust in scientists remains substantial. And even if we do the predicted trust in scientists at the state level, it also remains substantial. Finally, I'll look at mortality. And so this is mortality. On the x-axis is trust in science. On the y-axis is mortality. You can see, again, there's a clear relationship there. You can see trust in scientists. There's a negative relationship. When we put in vaccination, though, that trust in scientists relationship goes away. So it could be that the trust in science is leading to vaccination. And we know fairly well from lots of work that vaccination had a pretty large effect on mortality rates. And so that's a COVID story a little bit. I'm not done with it, but I'm going to just slightly pivot for a moment to talk about other public health outcomes. And so trust in scientists should matter across public health outcomes, right? Insofar as public health is really taking knowledge from scientists of different sectors, right? Depending on what the public health outcome is, or experts of different sectors. So if you trust the way that knowledge is produced by scientists, you're going to be more trusting of different public health advice, and therefore you should have better public health outcomes. So that seems like a straightforward argument. So we looked at flu vaccination, firearm deaths, cigarette taxes, and car accident deaths. And the idea here is that we should be able to, because of the stability, and because we think that there's a relationship between any public health outcome and trust, I'm going to take our trust measure from our survey, and I'm just going to plot it at the state level against these other public health outcomes. And so on the y-axis is the trust in science. This is for the top 4 are all from around 2020, 2021. Then I'll talk about the bottom 2. So this is the x-axis is trust in scientists, just on the scale. And then this is car deaths in 2020 by state. So you can see that there's a relationship there. The next one is firearm deaths by state. You can see there's a relationship there. Flu vaccination by state, relationship, and cigarette taxes by state. The bottom 2, this is car deaths from 1990. We chose these years arbitrarily. Car deaths from 1994 and car deaths from 1960. And so you're taking a trust in science measure from 2020. This is from our survey. And you're showing a relationship at the state level between a 2020 trust in scientists measure. And at the state level, car deaths in 1994, and then not as strong, but still a relationship with car deaths in 1960. And I should mention in 1960, there were still no speed limit laws. Is that right? I'm getting confused. There were no speed limit laws, but there were drunk driving laws. I think, yeah, New York had, yeah. So there were no speed limit laws, which probably made this relationship not as strong as it otherwise could have been. And we looked at various other types of outcomes over time. Again, the point being is that as COVID approached in some sense, you could have looked at public health outcomes going back way over decades, and you could have forecasted which states are going to do better or worse, right? There's a relationship going on here. So that's the trust part of the story. I've not said a lot about partisanship at the state level, right? I told you a partisan story a little bit at the individual level. The same thing should be happening at the state level. Just insofar as there is a partisan sorting of trust in scientists at the individual level, we'd expect it at the state level. So the next graph I'm going to show you also is from GSS data. And what we did was we just correlated by decade, by election year, in the election year, the correlation between state level trust and partisan vote in the state presidential election. And so what this is on the y-axis, on the x-axis is year, not labeled though, should have labeled it. And this is the correlation between Republican vote total in a state and trust in that state. So what you see, the first one is 1972, which was an odd election in so many ways, particularly because Nixon won almost every state. And so I don't know how much we should interpret the 1972 election. But so what you see then is just like in the individual data in these early elections, this is a positive correlation, means that means the Republican states are showing more trust. Then you see it declines over time. Oh, I did have the years right there. It's too clever for myself. And so you see it kind of declines. It pops back up. As I mentioned, in the individual level data, around 2000, it was pretty much even. You could see there's no significant difference, or there's no significant correlation in 2000. And then you can see, as I mentioned before, like the role of politics, you can see this enormous drop right around the 2012 election. And that's sustained. And so what that means is that we see the similar sorting at the state level as we do the individual level, right? So this is just a different way of showing you the same thing that I showed you with that individual level trust graph. The states are now divided by partisanship. So to make this figure, if I know I'm showing you a lot of figures, it's hard to follow, so this one will be a much starker demonstration of that. So this is a figure I've already showed you. This is the figure, right, on the y-axis is trust in scientists, on the x-axis is, on the x-axis is trust in scientists, on the y-axis is vaccination rate. So as I've already shown you, there's a pretty strong relationship. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you this figure 2 more times, but in one slide. But I'm going to show you in blue the states that are Democratic and in red the states that are Republican. And I'm going to do that from 1976, and I'm going to do that from 2016. So I'm using 2016 because it was exogenous to COVID. And so what you see here, right, in the 1976 picture, you see states are all over the place. You see a lot of blue states down here, low trusting, low vaccination. You see some red states up here, high trusting, high vaccination. But look at the 2016 vote total. All the blue states are up here, and all the red states are down here. The states moved around, and so we suddenly, right, if we had had the pandemic in 1976, okay, this would have been what the politics looked like of the pandemic, but we have it in 2020, and you're getting this sorting, so you have politics and low trust, and politics and high trust at the state level. So you can see this complete discoordination going on. And so that kind of leads to a lot of the combustion that we've seen subsequently, which I'll talk about in a moment. I'm not going to put up there. I have another slide that I'm going to skip over, but just for the sake of kind of thinking about it from various different outcomes that occurred during COVID-19, right? One of the ones that you hear a lot about is learning loss because schools closed too early. So what I did, the slide I'm not going to put up is messy because it has a lot of regression coefficients, and so I don't want to show that. Well, you can see it's messy, and so I just regressed learning loss at the state level. And I looked at partisanship and I looked at trust in scientists. And trust in scientists was pretty significant in explaining learning loss at the state level. So the states that were more trusting of scientists, even holding, if they were Democratic or Republican states, constant, they had more learning loss, particularly in English language and arts. And so there were consequences in both directions. And of course, if you talk to public health people, right, you're making trade-offs there. So but again, you're seeing the separation by partisanship, right? You would have probably seen the separation by, you would have seen separation by in mortality and learning loss and all these other outcomes, regardless of when you had this pandemic. But now it overlaps with partisanship nearly perfectly. And so what we have, right, is, as I mentioned, we have the CDC in 2025 change their vaccination schedules. We have these two set of democratic states forming these health alliances. We have Florida moving to cancel all vaccine mandates. And so you have this very inefficient system. So it undermines public health coordination. It generates lots of confusion. It's a very poor use of resources, right? They're duplicating each other or not duplicating each other. You're seeing this happen in other domains, abortion, K through 12 education, environmental policy, election laws. And so again, you're seeing kind of this chaos that's emerging in part because I think that there's this I know I'm inferring now from the data, but there's this overlap that's politicizing how people are thinking about science, and that's causing a lot of problems in the public health sector and really the destruction of the sector itself, at least at the federal level. And so the point that I want to make, and I'll come back to this at the end, I'm going to then try to show you something a little more positive before I'm not quite ending yet. But the summary up to this point then is that public health outcomes, including COVID-19, reflect at least in part structural patterns of trust in scientists, not just politics. So it was not just a contemporary political response that drove COVID, but it was what we saw in terms of the different reactions was really something that was in place for a long time. So the partisan sorting was what really drove the overlap in the politicized response. And you end up with very inefficient public goods provision. And of course, that's really bad for everybody. The inefficiency is really bad, and it's pretty easy to make a normative argument about what types of public good provisions would have been more positive during the pandemic, given that initial graph I showed you in the mortality rate in the US. So one of the things that comes up straightforwardly is, well, what can we do about that? And there's, there's lots of things we could discuss, and I'll come back to that at the very end. But one thing in the track so I'm shifting gears a little bit here. And so one of the things that I'm going to focus on is how do we build trust, right? So I'm going to take a normative stance, which I doubt will be very controversial here, but I think trust in science is generally a good thing to a point, right? You want to be somewhat skeptical of everything. So not to overstate that, but if you're going to go in one direction or another to close that gap, it's probably better to build the trust than to decrease the trust. So the argument that I would make is that you want to do that by thinking about who are the people who are distrusting. So think back to the very early in the presentation when I showed you those figures of the demographic groups, right? I showed you figures of the groups that were low trusting and high trusting. And some of you in the audience probably pretty quickly processed that the groups that were low trusting were the people who are not represented in science historically, right? Women, people of color, lower educated, lower class, rural, and religious, right? Those are the lower trusting groups. Those are groups that you would not find as present in science historically. We also know that similarity breeds trust, right? That's a very old thing that we know. People they trust people who are similar to them, including demographically similar to them. And so therefore, if we had a more kind of way to signal demographic similarity from science to individuals, that should help build trust in scientists. So in other words, if we diversify the scientific workforce, or at least the visible scientific workforce, that's a way that we could build trust in science. So I wanted to test that argument. And so what I did was a conjoint experiment, which a lot of you in the room are probably familiar with, but it's a task where I was asking people to choose between two different scientists. I said, I'm going to show you the profiles of two different scientists, and then choose which one of these two you would be more willing to follow vaccination advice from. And when I showed them, and then they do that several times. They did that 10 times. And the profiles kept changing. And so what I showed them in terms of the profiles was I varied the gender of the scientists randomly, more or less randomly, the race, the experience, the schooling. For schooling, because scientists are going to have some education, I did education prestige. So they were either from an Ivy League school or a public university. For religion, I did that by saying they either regularly speak at congregations about faith and science or regularly speak at a civic organization about science, where they grew up, rural or urban, and then class, which I talked about their parents and the careers of their parents. So the idea here, I know that's a lot to process. It's not critical that you look at all the details of this. What I'm really interested in is, are people going to be more trusting? In other words, are they going to choose to follow the advice of the scientists who match them demographically? So I'm not interested, except for experience. Experience is different because I wanted to see the impact of experience. what I'm interested in is not the impact of these particular levels, but I'm interested in, right, do people who are kind of lower educated, are they going to be more trusting of the people who went to the public universities? Or are women going to be more trusting of the women scientists, all else constant? And so what I'm going to show you are the outcomes of that, but the independent variables, so to speak, are the match between the respondents' characteristics and the characteristics of the people in the profile, if that makes sense. So on the x-axis is just the size of the coefficient. And so let me talk, this is class. And so on the left side of this line is the probability that you would choose scientist A. And on the right side is the probability you would choose scientist B. And so, right, this is showing you there's a class match with scientist A. In other words, the respondent is the same class as scientist A. And you can see they, not significantly, but slightly more likely to choose scientist A. If there's a class match with scientist B, they're more likely to choose scientist B. So that's a mixed result. But if you look at rurality, right, if there's a match, you're more likely to pick the match. If there's a religious match, non-religious or religious. So this is, right, rural or urban. If there's a match, you're more likely to pick the match. Religious, if you're religious, you're more likely to choose the scientist who spoke at congregation. If you're non-religious, then you're more likely to choose the one who spoke at civic organizations. You can see that's a pretty sizable effect. There's no impact of education or educational prestige. Race, you see a pretty large effect. So people are going to choose the scientist who shares their race. Gender, you see a substantial effect. And then you can see, not surprisingly, experience dwarfs all of those effects. So that's meaningful. The interesting thing, though, is if you add up all of those things, you basically equal experience. And so, like, if you had a perfect match on all those dimensions, you end up equaling experience. Right? So like, right, I would be kind of upper middle class, I would be urban, I would be non-religious, I would be high educated, I would be white, I would be male. If I matched up all those matches with me, that basically is leading me to choose that scientist at a similar level as the scientist who had more experience. And so that's some evidence that this matching effect is going on here. But even more interesting than that, so what I'm going to show you next is I'm going to break this out. I'm going to show you the same figure, but 2 times. I'm going to look at it for those who are underrepresented in science, so the low trusting groups. And I'm going to look at it separately for those who are overrepresented in science, so the high trusting groups. So I'll walk you through what I'm showing you exactly. I should have put this on 2 different slides, perhaps. So this is the overrepresented groups. This would be the white, male, highly educated, non-religious, urban, forgetting one of the characteristics, male. And so what you see here is, right, there's no class effect. So this would be kind of middle upper class. They don't really care about class if you're middle upper class. This would be urban. They don't really care about urban. Religion they care about, right? They don't want a religious scientist. Educational prestige they care about a little bit. Race match they care about a little bit. It's pretty small. Gender match they don't care, and experience still has a large effect. Okay, so the most relevant thing here is I think the religion was going on here for the overrepresented groups. When we look at the underrepresented groups, so right, this would be lower or working class, rural, religious people, non-college educated. This is the Hispanic respondents, this is Black respondents, female, and then again, experience. You see there's a much more consistent trend here. So class matters, urban rural, or rurality matters, religiosity actually matters, but much less to less represented people. Education still doesn't matter. Race matters. Race matters for both Hispanic and Black respondents, and gender matters. So in other words, this matching effects occurs across the whole population, and it's particularly salient when you look at the people who are underrepresented in science, which really makes a lot of sense, right? You don't think that your interests are being taken seriously, right? If you think about this from the perspective of somebody who feels like their group has not been underrepresented, they haven't gotten the right kind of data, they haven't been studied, we don't have good advice, so I'm thinking of women generally, historically. You might be more trusting if somebody who looks like you might share your interests and be more likely to create that trust. And so if I aggregate this up, this is a bit of a reach because this is, this very abstract experiment, but just for the sake of hypotheticals, if I look at this at the state level, so if I imagine that we're going to increase the number of matches, right, at the state level. So I'm just going to kind of show you on the x-axis if the number of matches increase. Well, I should back up for a second because otherwise this won't make sense what you're seeing. So over the course of this experiment, everybody saw 10 of these profiles or these matched profiles. So they were making this decision 10 times, which means that over the course of the experiment, they were seeing lots of matches or not matches, right, across. So there's 6 different demographics, and then there's 10 times, and so there's and there's 2 scientists, right? So they're seeing 120 potential matches, okay? And if over the course of all of the experiment. So what we did, this was not an expected finding, but what we did, we had a measure before they did any of those conjoints. We had a measure of what their trust in scientists was, and then we had this general trust in scientists, and then we had the same measure at the end of the experiment. And so what we did was we just counted the number of matches that they saw over the course of the experiment, right? So given my demographics, right, I would have randomly had somewhere between, I don't know, like 40 and 80 matches, right? So it would have been like, I would have been thinking like scientists are more or less like me over the course of all of this experiment. And it turns out the more matches that you see, the more you end up having a higher trust in science at the end of the experiment. And so I'm going to take that and I'm going to say, okay, at the state level, if we just increase the number of kind of matches that we see, but we do it for Republican states, so those who identified as being from a Republican state versus those who identified being a Democratic state, you can end up kind of collapsing that polarization gap a little bit. So this is the number of matches that you see, right? This is the predicted trust in scientists. And so what you see here is the light line is the Republican states. And so what you see is the number of matches increases, the trust goes up at a much higher rate than in the Democratic states, which almost is mechanical insofar as given the result that I found before, given that there's a larger potential matching effect for Republicans, all else constant, because they're going to be from demographics that are going to show you a larger effect than the Democrats, given the other results that I showed. So I know that might have been hard to follow, but the point is if you can increase the diversity of the scientific workforce, there's some evidence that you can increase the trust in scientists. And two comments on that. When I say increase the diversity of the scientific workforce, I mean diversity in kind of all the dimensions that I spoke about, right? So obviously there have been a lot of very successful initiatives in increasing diversity of people of color, increasing gender diversity, but also things like rurality diversity, things like religiosity, like acknowledging religious diversity, class diversity, and so kind of across all of those characteristics, not just the ones that we might commonly associate with the Democratic Party. I had a second point and I lost it. And so to summarize, obviously, even if you kind of follow this advice, and obviously in the current environment where even using the word diversity would have been problematic, diversifying the scientific workforce it's obviously politically fraught. So that, and even if it wasn't, that would take many decades, right? There's been some work that's showing like these initiatives, if they were fully successful, you still wouldn't really end up with an entirely kind of diversified representative scientific workforce. The inertia is just too slow. But you can communicate science differently. And so I want to come back a little bit to kind of the communications that were going on during COVID and kind of give you at least my opinion, which is I thought the communication was pretty bad. And part of that was because it was a very deficit model-driven communication approach, right? It was kind of like, here's science, follow the science. And part of that was because the people that were charged with doing the communication were not communication experts, right? They were scientists. And then you ended up, you ended up with these journals, these magazines and journals making presidential endorsements. So the one I put on there, right, was from Scientific America, which is the longest continuously published entity in the United States. It's been over 175 years. First time they ever made a presidential endorsement was 2020. And as most of you are probably familiar, Nature made a presidential endorsement. I think Science made of, lots of entities did. I think that's sorry? I don't think that's why Biden won, but darn, I'm glad, I appreciate your optimism. There was an experiment that actually looked at the impact of these endorsements, and it showed that amongst Republicans, it lowered trust in scientists. And so the concern is, right, if you're starting to make a partisan claim on science, that can become backfiring. I do understand why they did it at the time, so I don't mean to be overly critical. I, in fact, know the editor of the Scientific America who led this, and I understood where she was coming from and her audience, and thinking that this is going to have a large impact on the election it's not. But as a general matter, if we infer from that, right, the way you want to communicate is to build bridges, right, to engage in listening. And so one way you can do this is by signaling allyship very carefully. but to kind of show that there's an appreciation for the interest in having conversations with groups that are underserved and trying to think about ways to build trust that way. So more of a community bottom-up based messaging approach, which I think is consistent with the results that I showed you before. So let me finish up. So trust in scientists is stable correlates. It's polarized around partisan lines. That's kind of shaped COVID response. The emergence of partisan cleavage is really bad. We're in a really bad cycle, right? Because what is happening is you're going to see these states going in different directions. And then the other thing that is really concerning, right, at the federal level, we've seen the complete destruction of scientific institutions. And then let's say that's the Democratic Party comes into power and they try to reconstruct these scientific institutions. Not only is that going to take a while, but they might do that. But then let's say that the Republican Party then comes into power and destroys the scientific institutions. And insofar as you want scientific institutions to have the institutions that are sticky, that's really, we're going to end up with, very problematic situation. So even beyond the short-term destruction, you might end up with this ping-ponging effect if you can't find a way to kind of overcome some of the actions in trust that you're looking now. So 3 lessons for what I think are social sciences. One is the lack of, as I kind of mentioned my take on healthcare, public health communications, there was a real lack of social science input on that. So if you look at Biden's coronavirus task force, there were no social scientists on that task force. And COVID was obviously a huge social problem. And so I don't put that on the administration. I think that it's just really hard. Social scientists, it's not been something that we've thought a lot about, like how to make ourselves more present in public policy decisions. And so I think that's a challenge for the discipline. State politics, we know a lot about state politics. I think we have to start thinking very seriously about expertise beliefs at the state level. And then there's kind of polarization of trust in scientists and other institutions, right? We see polarization of all kinds all around. And as I showed you in that brief aside, when I put up the different polarization of institutions, we can kind of look at that and kind of get a sense of where the country's polarizing and the cleavages that are emerging beyond the historical economic cleavages. And so the last few slides, so right, this is just, I showed you before polarized trust in institutions. This is just trust in institutions. And you can see here that except for the military, they're all, this is talking about the stressed country that I don't think I need to convince you of, but you can see here, like, there's declining trust in institutions, largely speaking. This is a familiar graph to all the political scientists in the room, affective polarization, which is just how much you like your party versus not the other party from the ANES. So you can see that's kind of risen over time. Actually, even more striking than the affective polarization graph is if we look at external efficacy from the ANES over time. So that's really, so this is how much, sorry, I should be explaining what's on the graphs. So this is the years on the x-axis, and this is the average external efficacy on the y-axis. Basically, how much do you think you're represented in politics? And so you can see here that there's been a huge drop since 2000. And so these are all not great science. And then the last one that I'll show you is this. This is from the GSS. This is just a happiness graph. And what's really amazing about this is the stability of happiness. We're already not a very happy country, but it's been at least a very stable in their happiness. But then you see this drop, right with COVID. But it hasn't returned, right? This includes 2024 data, so it hasn't returned. And so, I think that in terms of thinking about the consequences of all this political fracture on well-being, also is something that can cycle back. So I don't want to. I'm going to put up one more slide because I don't want to end on an extremely sad note. Because speaking of happiness, I want to emphasize that I imagine the people in this room are quite happy. So congratulations to Michigan for. So, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, I couldn't delay the talk another day. So there are things that you can be happy about in your day-to-day life as well. But thank you. I know it's a long talk. I appreciate your patience. So thank you. Okay. There's another one here. I think it was just. I thought there were two too, but.
I've got two quick questions. And also, thanks so much for coming. This was a very interesting, stimulating talk. I wanted to go back early in your talk where you showed for the first time the level of trust in the United States, and trust becomes your fundamental factor in the United States. And I wondered, insofar as that's true, and that's a thread that ran through your entire talk, of course, whether there's comparative evidence from, I don't know, what I'll call affluent temporary democracies around the world, and whether trust in science is different there in a way that makes sense of our relative failure in responding to COVID. And then secondly, you are giving weight to trust over partisanship for the most part. And I wondered if you looked at this. The demographic categories were interesting, but you left one out that I think is very interesting, which is region, and North versus South in particular. The South is interesting because over the last 50 years, it's been pretty stable in terms of demographics. The Great Migration has stopped. In fact, it's slightly reversed. There's movement into the South, but it's not dramatically different than what the South was before. It's stable demographically, but politically, it's completely upside down.
Right, and that drove much of what I was showing,
And if that's true, then the South becomes an interesting test because I think from your point of view, trust in science should be stable in the South, despite the fact that it's completely turned over politically.
Yeah, so those are great questions as always. So thank you, Don, and thank you for coming. In terms of the comparative evidence, during COVID, there is certainly evidence from around the world that there is a strong correlation between trust in science from many countries and vaccination and mortality. So that was a pretty clear finding. There was a great worldwide study of trust in scientists that came out last year, and they looked at, I'm thinking, 50 some odd countries or 65 countries, I think. And the interesting thing about that was trust is pretty high in every country, but it's divided ideologically in nearly every country. But the US was clearly an outlier in terms of the extent of the ideological division, which, if you think about countries that you might know about, that's pretty sensible. It kind of computes. The other interesting thing about those data is that they looked at the relationship between kind of faith in public health and trust in scientists, and that was an extraordinarily strong relationship across every country, which I thought was quite interesting. I don't know if I would have thought that per se going in, that people really kind of couple those things together. Those data, I think they're doing a lot of things with those data. It was a big data project, so I think there could be more coming out of that I could make use of. So I appreciate that. I haven't seen anybody kind of look at the partisanship and trust, and I don't mean, I know it's totally fair to say it almost appears as I'm racing them against each other, and I don't mean to do that, even though I think I come across that way, because I think the larger problem is not necessarily which one is driving which, but rather it's that they're intersected with each other. And so I think your point about the South is really an excellent one. And I think I can look at that. That would be very easy to do. I think my expectation, right, is that trust should be stable in the South, but partisanship will not be stable in the South. And so, and again, I think you also tapped on, right behind that partisan sorting, almost all of that was kind of the Southern states kind of switching. And so that is a large driver of what's going on here. So in some sense, it was something that could have been going on years ago if politics would have played out differently, different timing of things.
Okay, I have one question. Medical science has become much more sophisticated and complex, particularly in the last 2 decades. And this, of course, affects what our response is, particularly because our information sources are getting more and more scarce for those people who don't have access to that kind of education and information. So do you have any comments about this?
In terms of accessing medical information?
Well, when you're talking about people's reaction to medical information, the problem is it's become much more complicated to understand, and only people who are more sophisticated in their background to understand more complex situations can adequately respond. And so it's not too surprising when the poorer fraction of the population, it takes a lot much more persuasion to follow what seems to be from the rest of us a more appropriate approach.
Yeah, so that's a great question on many levels. And so one interesting thing, and I'll answer the question more directly in a second, but if we instead of looking at science, we looked at trust in medicine, you don't see the same patterns. And so people, even though people think a lot about medical science when you talk about scientists, so I probed what people are thinking about when you ask them about trust in scientists, and I looked at all these different disciplines. Political scientists are really low trusting, unfortunately. But when they think about medicine, they're thinking more about their primary care provider. And so there are very different dynamics of trust in medicine. That doesn't answer your question. So I think there is a huge communication problem for medicine, or challenge, I should say, insofar as the information ecosystem is such now that there's, this is obvious, but there's just a proliferation of medical information, and people, it's difficult to navigate for anybody. And so there's a real, it's not only just an expertise of medicine, but it's also kind of a digital literacy, skills. Like, how can you navigate all that's out there? And then just a communication challenge for physicians themselves. And my sense, again, not knowing a lot of people who've gone through medical school recently, but my sense is that they're cognizant of the communication challenges that they face as doctors. I don't know what's being done about that or how that's changing. But I do think that, I think the focus on how medical providers communicate, though, is essential. And the reason so I think it's a crucial question, because that is a point where much of the population actually has contact with an institution, right? Most of the population doesn't have contact with a scientist. We actually collected data on that too. But most people, most fortunate people have some contact with health, right? And so that's a hub where you could kind of get a lot of action if it's used in a clear, at least in a clear way. So I think it's a great point.
This actually is exactly what I wanted to sort of dig deeper on, which is this distinction between the individuals that we're dealing with and the institutions within which they're nested. And it's long struck me that one of the interesting challenges here, and I'd love your thoughts given all of this and sort of the proximity demographically to people who are described as scientists versus the proximity to the actual institutions where science is happening, which presumably highly correlate with that in a lot of contexts. And so, is it that people are feeling like scientists are demographically not like them, or is it that those institutions that are science, unlike the ones that are medicine, are just much more distant, and that distance is part of what's driving it?
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer directly. The distance question is great. So I'm not going to answer that. I mean, I'm going to say something, right? But I think that's a great question. I haven't really so you're thinking about like control, and so
like the institutions.
So I'm going to answer that indirectly, but because I think it's a great point, I have to think more about. One is that people do. So I did look. People do have stereotypes of who fits into these institutions, the demographic compositions of those institutions, both at the kind of general level and at the people who run the institutions level. And they're consistent with partisan kind of stereotypes of demographic composition. And the partisan perceptions of these institutions are really substantial, right? So the institutions that Democrats trust more, like people think every scientist is a Democrat, and every professor, high person in education is Democrat. So there's definitely like a lot of that perception going on at the individual level. And so I think one of the challenges actually is first to build trust, separate from the approach that I took, would be to try to communicate better that there's an institution beyond the people in the institution, and the institution has methods and approaches systematically that try to produce knowledge in a certain way or serve whatever function that institution is supposed to be doing, and that hopefully unbiases in a sense, or that's not the right word exactly, but something about how the institutions work, because I don't think people have a great sense of how the institutions work and the role that the institutions can play. And so I think that there's an important point. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, I was thinking uh, the song, What Would You Do If I Sang Out of Tune? You are asking the question about how do I match with the communicator? And you say that if I match, then I may be persuaded. But how about the message?
Yeah.
I mean, if there was a Black woman pastor that would tell me, if you don't take this medicine, I am also a doctor, and if you don't take this medicine, you're going to die, I would take the medicine, okay? And you show the thing that there is a higher mortality if they don't listen to doctors.
Yeah.
Why don't you test that part?
So testing in terms of the extent to which
The message.
Yeah.
What
the
is the message?
Yeah.
I mean, and for me, it is a big discrepancy. How is it possible that these people hear all around them that they are going to die if they don't do the vaccine?
I think part of
they choose not to do it.
Yeah, I think part of it. So I agree with you. The message is obviously part of the story in terms of any persuasion story. I think part of the reason that I focused on the source instead of the message was there was a lot of study of kind of different messages during COVID in particular about what would be more effective at getting vaccine uptake. And I think that a lot of that work was kind of mixed results. I think it was very hard to, there was no silver bullet of messaging. The other thing is I think I was very interested in kind of structural things that you might be able to do rather than kind of in this point in time persuade people. So I agree. I think if you're trying to create a communication strategy, you have to think more than the messenger. In fact, I think that was also a lesson of COVID because some of the COVID commercials that went on, right, they were really just trying to get demographic diversity, but they weren't getting it from experts. And so I don't think those were very effective either. And so I do think that I think the message plays an important role. I wasn't interested in the message in this point because I was interested in these kind of tying it to more structural makeup of the institutions, and also because I think the message, I felt a little discouraged from the types of things that I found that people were finding in terms of COVID messaging. I mean, there were some things that seemed a little bit more effective than other things, but my take was that it was a pretty mixed set of results.
I had a question about the building trust aspect of this. I thought that was super intriguing. The question I have is regarding like backlash to some of those efforts. Some of the groups that presumably could use some boost in the scientific community are stereotypically Republican groups.
Yeah.
Some of those are stereotypically Democratic groups. Do you think we're in an environment where we can pump up the numbers of scientists in those groups and build trust without losing trust amongst other groups? And I think that mostly comes from a place that most of those groups have experienced increasing representation in science over the last 10 or 20 years when we've seen this sort of polarization of trust. So how do we manage that? How do we balance that by building it amongst some groups without risking losing it from others?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point and question. So within the confines of this very abstracted experiment, there were not backlash effects. So I found that promising, right? So it wasn't when the white male was seeing the non-white woman giving advice, they didn't become less trusting per se. They were just indifferent, right? They weren't not indifferent. That said, obviously in the experiment, there was no politicization attempts going on, right? So there wasn't like, let's follow a diversity initiative and now let's attack this diversity initiative. And so I think from a kind of a structural institutional perspective, it's going to be very difficult for exactly the reasons that I was talking about, because there's this overlap in science, particularly in partisanship. Any effort within science is going to be politicized, and then you end up in the world that you're living in. I still think that it's useful, though, at a more local level, right? Because there are a lot of these kind of bridging organizations that do science communication or science outreach, And I think those groups are very effective in many cases, especially around things like climate and trying to provide climate relief or climate adaptation. And in those cases, I think there could be local adaptations and kind of lessons from this. But in building, especially federal institutions, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's the sad state of things, right? Is that thinking about things at the federal level almost becomes kind of impossible at this point in time.
What role do you think scientific accomplishment plays in trust in science? So I'm thinking putting people on the moon or discovering cures to certain cancers that previously couldn't be cured, GLP-1s. It's remarkable in some ways reading your results is that over time, despite all these accomplishments and great things that we've done, people haven't changed their perceptions in science. But maybe there's a way of highlighting these messages that could inspire people, inspire more faith in the scientific establishment.
Yeah, it's such a great question. Part of it, it's probably a little hard to increase because, as I said, one thing to always keep in mind, which gets lost as I go through the whole talk, is that trust is pretty high amongst everybody. And so you're hitting a little bit of a ceiling, and in some ways, you don't want to go too high either. But I think your question is a great one. I have not seen work that has looked at the impact of scientific accomplishment. Obviously, it would have been neat to do something around the last week. I mean, it was striking in the last week that was not getting more. I mean, it's getting some coverage, but it seemed secondary to me. So yeah, I think it's a really good point. I guess I'd have to think about on what dimension, right? If we think about trust as involving honesty and competence and benevolence, I guess accomplishment would build competence. And I think the issue is that competence might not be the dimension that's really pulling people down. But I'm just thinking through that on the fly. I think it's a really great question, and it is, I may be just not knowing, but I have not seen anybody look at that in the science communication literature. But certainly I would imagine if the GSS went back into the 60s, we would have presumably seen a bump around the moon landing.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue talking about source effects in trust. And I resonate with the idea of diversity and enhancing the similarity of the scientist to the person receiving scientific communication. And with two thoughts, I want to get your reaction to them. The first thought is, well, if you scratch who we already have, you would find there's already a lot of diversity. It's just not divulged. I mean, if you scratch a lot of the people here, you'd find a lot of people with first-gen backgrounds. You'd find a lot of religiosity. You would find a lot of hidden diversity that you wouldn't know, hidden behind people's last names, for example. But I also think diversity hides an even bigger target, which is humanity. That is, there are a lot of ways that we are similar to, as scientists, to people receiving messages that don't have anything to do with regular categories. We are parents, we are sons and daughters, we are Michigan basketball fans in this region. We have quirky habits. There are lots of ways to establish the fact that we're not roles, but that we're human and that we share characteristics. And so diversity is a part of it, but establishing humanity is the bigger target that really matters. If you want to talk about source effects in terms of making a connection with people who scientists are trying to talk to.
Yeah, so thank you. Those are very helpful. So I could not agree more about the diversity point. And so it's actually quite interesting. How do we even define the scientific workforce? And so if you take the government definition, it's very broad, and the scientific workforce is about 25% of the population, because they're counting everybody who works at a hospital, for example. And so as you can imagine, it's extraordinarily diverse if you use that broad of a definition. So if you go on I think it's the NSF web page has all these data. And so again, depending how you slice it, it is remarkably diverse across every state. And so that's definitely an important point to keep in mind. And I fully agree on the similarity is really the lesson, whatever that similarity might be. So I think one of the insofar as it's not realistic and maybe it's not even the best approach to try to think about diversifying. I mean, I think there are reasons that you want to diversify the people who are doing the science for beyond even the trust reason. In fact, there's lots of arguments that have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. But I think on the ground, right, in terms of the communication, which is really the message that I was trying to get across, is that you want to communicate those similarities and engage in listening of those concerns. And so you want to build bonds. And so this was one way to build bonds in an abstracted experiment. If I in a follow-up, I would probably want to look at more of how the conversation was going. And I mean, this actually makes me think more about George's question. It's not, if I was to say like a message, it's less of a message per se than an approach to communication of listening. And I think that's really an important part. And you want to give people, one way to build trust is to let people feel efficacious. And if the people don't feel efficacious in a communication, then they're not going to be increasingly trustworthy of you. And so I think that's kind of a message, not quite, but some way of building that rapport and message. And so I think, I'm aligned. I think that's you put it very nicely. So.
Okay, thanks for a great talk. This overlaps a little bit with some of the questions been asked, but I want to ask it as it pertains to the person that is the individual that you're interviewing. Is there an assumption, I guess, that a rural person is confident that that rural people are underrepresented in medicine or in science? Maybe for Blacks, I think that might be more credible, but that rural people or religious people know that, no, there's very few religious people in science. I mean, is that indeed what people think?
Yes, so it's a great question. There was a step that I skipped over. And so I did collect data to ask people not exactly what you're asking, but I asked them how similar they thought they were towards 12 different professions. And towards scientists, it did align with all of the categories. So people who from those lower trusting categories all felt less similarity with scientists, and then similarity correlated pretty strongly with trust. And so yeah, I think the questions taken together about why has it been so stable? Because there's so much else that's changed. I think is a great question that I had not contemplated a lot of. I think I'm still, after looking at that graph for years, I'm still astonished by the stability. And so, this pushes me to think more of like the question of why has it been so stable.
Thanks, Jamie, for the really interesting talk. George's question actually got me thinking about all of those different studies with all the mixed results with the messaging. Like, if we could have done something like what you did in the US, like, could we overlay that on the mixed results? And like, would we all see the ones that were ineffective because of this sort of trust or sort of politicized trust? I feel like you do need a little bit of both in there as well, right? Versus the cases that were effective with the messaging might have been the ones where, either trust in science was high or that trust in science was sort of orthogonal to or unrelated to politics in some broader way. I'm thinking of the case I know the best is the Philippines, where we had, we also have low trust in science because we did have vaccines that were killing people at one point. But our version of our strongman was really pro-vaccination. So then the sort of political line that you would have expected based on what the US was like was the opposite. And so I wondered how much those two things need to be together to see a story like that, and whether we can use your work to essentially make a big meta study of all the failed messaging experiments that we were doing at the time.
So you would want to, it's a really intriguing question. So you'd want to look at basically the demographics of the people in those experiments?
Yeah.
Or the geography of it?
I know most of them were in the US, but the ones that were very either politicized or government driven type of messaging.
Yeah.
And I know all the different experiments were they were all testing the same dimension of messaging. But there were a few that were looking at trust in the messenger and credibility in the messenger.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you overlaid your framework onto those, you might be able to predict why, or to sort of show a pattern in why some of them worked and some didn't.
I think it's a great point, and it gets to one of the frustrations with, it's not a critique of those studies per se, but of messaging studies in general. They don't look a lot at heterogeneities. And it's really hard to look at heterogeneities because you almost never have enough power to look at heterogeneity. So it's a challenge for sure. But then they end up looking at specific populations who happen to fall into their data collection. And so we don't have a great sense of kind of that type of heterogeneity. So I like the idea that I can actually use this to have more pointed investigation of heterogeneities that could be going on. Yeah, so yeah, that's great. Thank you.
We've run to the end of our allotted time. Oh, this is a trick. They do this as a test for me. To see how well I remember it. After you go home and you're thinking about Ann Arbor and the time that you spent here in the lecture, we want to give you this plaque as a way to remember the event. Very carefully double wrapped. Right, another test.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This
This has been a wonderful presentation, very high quality questions, I thought. Please join me in thanking Jamie for it.